Hello and welcome to today's dark reading webinar, Drowning in Alerts, Cut the Noise and Tackle What's Real, sponsored by Critical Start and broadcast by Informa Tech Target. Terry Sweeney here, contributing editor to Dark Reading. I'll be your moderator today. Your team's buried under a flood of alerts. Most are useless, some are glitchy, and a handful could spell disaster. The catch is you're stretched too thin to sort out the mess. So join us now to learn more about how you can zero in on high-risk threats quickly, shut down real dangers, and save your analysts from burnout. On that note, I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. I'm happy to be joined by Tim Bandos, Field CISO with Critical Start. Tim, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Yep, Terry, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Before I hand it over to Tim, I just wanted to remind our audience of a couple of logistics. If you've been here before, you know this webinar is designed to be interactive between you and the speaker. At the bottom of your screen, there's some buttons that you can click on to learn about today's speaker, download a copy of the slides, and also post on social media. This is also where you'll participate in the Q&A that takes place at the end of the presentation. You can also use that Q&A area to alert us to any technical issues you may be experiencing. Our team will do their best to assist you there. That's it from my side. Let's get to it. Tim, the floor is yours.
Appreciate it, Terry. Drowning in alerts. Well, take a deep breath of air because this is the webinar for you. We're going to deep dive into how to cut through that noise and tackle what's real. So real quick, before we kick this off, I'd love to hear a description of your alert triage process using only a movie title. So if you guys could come up with a movie maybe you've seen in the past and how that relates to what we're going to talk about today, feel free to add it in the Q&A section. A couple titles that I could think of, maybe like The Panic Room, if you ever saw that movie, or The Perfect Storm. I think that was a pretty good one. Every time we have, alert come through and it turns into an incident, it sometimes does feel like a perfect storm. I actually remember during Hurricane Irma, I'm out of Tampa, Florida. We were actually evacuating. My wife is 9 months pregnant at the time, and we had an incident that I needed to respond to. So as we're evacuating from Florida, my wife goes into labor. I have this incident, and everything just felt like a perfect storm at the time. So it literally sums it up for me. We actually ended up naming her Eloise Storm. It almost felt, kind of appropriate. Ooh, The Running Man. We got The Matrix, Wag the Dog. Got some good ones so far. All right, thanks for your participation, guys. So here's a quick agenda of what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit of an introduction. We're going to understand what alert fatigue is and how it affects your organization. Then we're going to talk about security data source prioritization. How do you prioritize the sources of information that are going into your SIM or your log sources? How do we do alert reduction techniques? And then also, of course, we got to talk about artificial intelligence. I mean, what webinar now these days, you're not injecting some sort of AI. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end of the conversation. All right, so before we kick this thing off, I'd love to talk about myself. Who am I? Where did I come from? My name is Tim Bando, so I am Field CISO here at Critical Start. We are an MDR, vendor-agnostic organization where we can take in all your different data sources and provide and deliver managed detection response type services. However, where have I come from? So over the last 20 years or so, I started out working at DuPont, chemical manufacturing company, science company. I was responsible for protecting over 100,000 endpoints at the time. I built our 24/7 security operations center. I did incident response, digital forensics, malware reverse engineering. This is really where I fell in love with cybersecurity, was working for this company. Although I almost felt like I needed a little bit more. I was protecting one company. I wanted to protect thousands. So I decided to pivot into the vendor world, the cybersecurity vendor world, and I haven't looked back since. So I worked for Digital Guardian. I was their CISO there for about 6 years. I ran their managed security service offering and really built out an EDR type service as well at that organization. Then we got acquired in 2021, which was awesome. And then followed up with that, I worked at Exidium, formerly Komodo Cybersecurity. I was their CISO and EVP of security of SOC services. So that was a great opportunity as well. But love working at Critical Start, and this is what we're going to talk about today: alert fatigue and how do we reduce it. So stats. We always start out with a big stat number. 92%, right? Percentage of organizations that feel that they are overwhelmed by an endless sea of alerts. Of course, that's not how it was worded in the survey, but basically organizations feel like there's so many alerts that they cannot possibly triage through all of them, or they miss things of interest, things that need or require additional investigation. And what is the result of that? A lot of that comes down to alert fatigue. And what alert fatigue is, it occurs when security teams become desensitized almost, right, to the overwhelming amount of information and alerts that are coming into their SIM. And it also oftentimes causes them to miss or overlook critical alerts and maybe have slower response times. And this ultimately leads, I think, to disastrous consequences. I remember hiring, we had an intern back at DuPont, and then we hired him on, and he was, entry-level security analyst, incredibly bright individual. And one of the first jobs I gave him was doing phishing analysis, so triaging phishing alerts that came in. And after about, I would say, several weeks of doing this, I could see that he was becoming a little fatigued. He thought it was boring. He didn't understand the point of it. I always feel like you need to start from the bottom, right, and really dig in and understand and learn, what you're looking at, right, from a security event perspective, so you can kind of elevate, escalate and go on through the tiers of being a security analyst. Unfortunately, he didn't feel that way. And one day he overlooked a phishing alert that came in. He marked it off as a false positive, and that was ultimately a state-sponsored espionage campaign from an APT threat actor, right, looking to steal one of our, trade secrets within the organization. Now, luckily, we had backup, SOC analysts that saw it the next day, and we were able to actually shut this out. But it was because he felt fatigued, and he just wasn't interested in doing that. And I think maybe he was feeling overwhelmed, right, by the amount of alerts that were coming in. So unfortunately, it does have, consequences associated with it. So what fuels SOC alert fatigue? Well, there's false positives, right? When your tools are crying wolf 24/7, your team, sometimes they stop listening, and eventually I think these real threats slip through while your analysts are focusing on other tasks. False positives is a problem, so that comes down to tuning properly and ensuring that you are removing those false positives, from your environment, and you're not triaging the same alerts that are coming in. Maybe there's a lack of context. SOC alerts that show up without any sort of background information or severity indicators, they force analysts to spend more time investigating the wrong things. So it's good to have contextual knowledge of, what are they even investigating? What is this alert associated with? Is this a high risk server? Is this a low fidelity type of alert or high fidelity alert? All that information contextually needs to be added, right, and quantified before you really get into doing that investigation process, because it helps them. Maybe lack of integration. Most enterprises today have 50 to 75 plus security tools deployed, and almost none of them talk with one another unless you kind of do this best of breed full platform sort of play. And even there, even with that sort of scenario, you do have some consequences with that too. But it's good to have interoperability with the tools that you have deployed, either from a SOAR perspective or just from a visibility perspective, so that you can kind of talk with one another. Maybe there's poorly defined management process in place. Maybe that, things aren't well defined, or you have too few hands on deck. We always hear this as, we don't have enough security analysts. We don't have enough, team members. We're understaffed. We're overworked. Alerts are piling up, and it's harder to keep pace with the volume that's coming in. A lot of that can be solved a lot of times from keeping track of metrics. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but it's important to keep metrics on everything that you're doing from a SOC and a security operations center perspective, because you can report and bubble that up. This is where we're falling short, and this is the delay in time that we have in terms of investigating, because we don't have enough analysts. And then maybe limited customization, right? All right, so what does this lead to ultimately? So here are the effects of alert fatigue. You have a decreased responsiveness. Maybe you have slower response times to alerts and incidents that are coming in, just because they are exhausted. Just as an example, here at Critical Start, we've got 3 to 4 different shifts where we shift times. We have morning shift, afternoon shift, night shift, overnight shift, and we constantly change and evolve that schedule, because we don't want individuals feeling fatigued or overworked, and we're always moving that around. So that's incredibly important. Maybe you have high risk of incidents too because of that, right? Higher likelihood of missing critical events. We've seen this in the news, where something came across the wire and it was missed. Maybe you have burnout and turnover, lower job satisfaction, and higher stress levels. I've seen that throughout the course of running, SOC security operations center teams. If you don't have an organization where you have a career path for individuals as well, where they feel like they're moving through the different ranks. Maybe they want to be a security analyst level 2 or level 3, or maybe they want to pivot into incident response or do threat hunting. I think it's important to have a career path for individuals that do work on those SOC teams, so that when you do have that element of feeling burnt out, right, you can try to transition them into another role so they get refreshed and they're learning new things. So that's important as well, as to address that. And then maybe you have higher operational costs, increased downtime and resource utilization. A lot of times we don't think about maybe the business implications indications of a particular server being down. When I was working at DuPont, just as an example, we had a particular site where if that server was down for even just 1 hour, it was costing us $10,000 per hour, right? So if you have maybe a ransomware incident or an event where it takes that device offline for a day or 2 days, that could equate to $500,000 or $1 million or more. So that really kind of talks about the operational costs of a breach and what that could do, right, from even just producing product and getting that information out. So we talk about a few examples, right, that we've seen over the years. Remember the Target breach? I know this was a while ago. Actually, this is I think it was over 12 years ago. I think 2013, where there were some ignored alerts, right, from the tools that were coming in. So it might be kind of hard to see the timeline that I put here, but an alert triggered within Symantec. They also had FireEye deployed, and unfortunately, the security analysts missed it. This was an incident where hackers gained access via a third-party HVAC vendor, so supply chain risk. Right? And they were able to exfiltrate credit card information from over 40 million customers. I mean, that is a massive impact, right, to Target at the time. And a lot of that stems back to, either alert fatigue or missing alerts that are coming in. And it wasn't until, you can see when the alert triggered 11:30, it wasn't until 12:15, several weeks later, where they were able to start removing that malware off of, the point of sale devices and really kind of clean up that particular breach. So that can be difficult. Right. And it was a massive breach. It actually ended up costing the organization over $162 million. So once again, real world implications to, missing a particular event or an alert. Remember, we had the SolarWinds breach. This was a bad one. This is when we had nation state hackers injecting malware into that SolarWinds Orion software. I think this was during COVID time, actually. It was, in December 2020 is when it was uncovered. But that stood to be one of the most significant cyber espionage incidents in history. Right, if we think about it, involved a supply chain attack again, where they had Russian state-sponsored hackers that, I think it was Cozy Bear, that compromised their Orion platform and was injecting malicious code into those Orion updates. So when customers deployed those updates, unfortunately, they had malware within their environment. So this was a massive breach, and a lot of it, stemmed back to, obviously the attackers leveraging highly stealthy techniques, but they avoided obvious alerts too on the security, analyst side. So this is what came out of that particular breach as well. And then finally, we also had the OPM breach. This is where we had those Chinese APT hackers. They stole sensitive personnel records of 21 million, government employees. Once the investigation rolled through, they identified that those indicators of compromise were reportedly present for months, before full detection. So analysts, once again, distracted by the noise, and ultimately they lacked effective prioritization, looking at the alerts that are coming in and making sure that they're triaging those events in a timely manner. And, breach to a government system like this, or to any sort of government system, that could have massive national security implications, if you don't have, alert reduction and triaging properly in place. So how do you make sense of, your log sources, and how do you prioritize? If you think about it, once again, all the different, data sources that you have, EPP platforms, DLP, vulnerability, DHCP, physical security alerts, from card readers, how do you prioritize, what makes sense and what you need to focus on? Well, at Critical Start, this is how we particularly kind of solve that. Now, I know there might be some people on this call that get mad at me with me putting some people or some of those data sources to the lower end of the bucket. But from our perspective, the greatest return on investment are the data sources that you see to the left, right? So looking at authentication activity, email security, MFA activity, most importantly, in my opinion, endpoint protection platforms like EDR technology and antivirus, right? That's when you start to see and have true visibility on the endpoints. If you see malicious programs executing, or even just living off the LAN attacks where you see suspicious PowerShell execution, those are the highest level of, I think, criticality or fidelity of alerts that you can get. Right, because that gives you that instant visibility. Someone might say, hey, why do you have DLP all the way to the right? Listen, I've been in the DLP space, and although I do think it can be a high fidelity data source, it needs to be tuned properly as well. DLP is all about context. What are the internal policies? Can individuals, transfer data to a USB device? Can individuals upload data to, specific cloud repositories? Now, alerts can once again be tuned to make it higher fidelity, but I put DLP all the way to the right just because I feel like it's not as high fidelity as some of these other ones. So that's how, prioritization plays a role, making sure that you're also mapping to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and you're tuning those detections as you move along. So what does it come down to? What does that process look like from, alert reduction? So at the very top, we have ingestion. So 100% of your events come in. These are the raw events as they come in. We then need to apply tuning and whitelisting. And you want to be careful, of course, with whitelisting because you don't want to remove, what you think is noise, but then it turns out to be, anomalies that you could have leveraged for an investigation. But it's important to filter because if you don't filter, you're just going to be inundated with, a significant amount of alerts and events, and it's going to be really difficult to manage. Once you've done and gone through that filtering process, it's important then to enrich it, add behavioral and contextual information. Just as an example, when we were defining rules for lateral movement type activity, we wouldn't allow PS exec to occur in certain subnets, at DuPont, right, at that organization that I worked at. So as soon as PS exec executed, in that particular subnet, we knew that there was some sort of breach or there was something that needed to be investigated. We consider that a higher fidelity alert. So that's kind of adding context to your environment because that's not supposed to occur, transpire in your environment. And sure enough, we actually had an alert one day of PS exec running in that particular subnet. And that was once again an infiltration. We were able to immediately respond and kick the threat actors out. So it's important to add that kind of behavioral element to it. And then users and entities, enriching that information with user information, type of information of the server itself. Is this a critical asset? Does this contain trade secret information or intellectual property, right? So once again, enriching the data of the alerts that are coming in can also help the analysts as they're triaging. And then, of course, mapping to the MITRE framework. It's almost table stakes these days, to map to the MITRE tech framework because it's fantastic. It goes from, the beginning of reconnaissance all the way down to data exfiltration and movement and looking at all those different behaviors that threat actors, the tactics and techniques that they leverage as they infiltrate an organization, as they look for information to steal and exfiltrate throughout your organization, as they, look to, acquire credentials and do credential dumping, right? All of those behaviors are important. And if you once again map those to your alerts, you then can focus on the less than 1% to trigger the anomalies, right? These are the anomalies that you're going to want to investigate and spend your time on because ultimately that's what's going to once again provide you the most return on investment of your time, right, as you're investigating. So one thing that we do, and once again, this is not a vendor pitch. You don't have to go with Critical Start, but this is how we do it. And there's just certain methods that all organizations need to think through of how they go through the process of whitelisting and filtering out that news. This is just our example. So we leverage something called our Trusted Behavior Registry. So it's kind of a blend of leveraging AI and also leveraging knowing the laws of an operating system, knowing the laws of a network, and whitelisting and tuning out elements that just there are events that aren't of interest, right? We understand what's good, known good. Anything that falls outside of is either known bad or unknown. Those are the elements that we're going to look at. Ultimately, we can then do workload reduction at scale. So 90% of alerts that typically come in across all of our customers here at Critical Start, they're the same. I mean, it's, even though you have different types of environments, most of the time, at least 90% of the alerts are going to be very similar. And these are the types of alerts that can be added to a trusted behavior registry of known good events that are allowed to automatically trigger. The Windows operating system has PowerShell built in, and a lot of times it might, execute PowerShell scripts continuously. And we might see that same command being executed across all of our customers. And it's not necessarily malicious, but it's something that's going to trigger an alert out of an EDR solution because it's PowerShell, because it's a living off the land type of tool, right? So looking at all those different types of events, making sure that you have the ability to triage that data out automatically and filter that data out so that the analyst doesn't even see it is going to be incredibly important. Because if you continue to allow those same types of events to come in and triage through, that's where alert fatigue is ultimately going to be, introduced against your organization. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with 9% of the alerts being unique to organizations. This is where it does require, I think, a lot more tuning, but then it's important to adapt your filters, your playbooks, to the context of your environment. So if you have specific users that execute, certain types of utilities or have certain types of behaviors, IT admins, a lot of times they'll execute really strange commands, or they're moving laterally across the environment and they might make a ton of noise and they might look suspicious on the filter, but at the same time, it could be legitimate behavior. Now, I do caution around IT admins to whitelist out admin behavior because a lot of times adversaries target IT administrators because they know they have the keys to the kingdom. They know that they have domain admin credentials potentially sometimes, right? So I think it's important to tune and whitelist, but also be careful, who you're tuning as well. So that's very critical. But tuning out scripts and temporary behaviors and things that you commonly see across your environment, that's okay, right? Because those are unique to your environment, and those are elements that, once again, you don't want necessarily your SOC team to have to investigate time in and time again. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with escalating the white alerts, based on what we're seeing to contain breaches and isolate threats. And that's that, 1%, the less than 1% that need to be resolved. And this is where it's important, to identify those items that do actually require a response. Sometimes those items maybe require additional context. Maybe we have to reach out to our customers to provide that business context of what this alert is. But let's say you have your own internal SOC team. That's easier for you guys to investigate at the time, right? But for those that occur maybe in the middle of the night, let's say you don't have SOC team members that are 24/7. This is where leveraging an MDR provider, something that's a little bit outsourced, is imperative, right? Because threat actors don't go to sleep, right? They're up at all nights of the hour. I've had intrusions at 3 in the morning when we didn't have a 24/7 SOC team, and unfortunately those are the worst nights that I can recall, having to wake up and then go into the data center and actually respond to an incident, right? And that's ultimately what got us funding to have a 24/7 SOC team. But kind of going through that pain, this is really advice so you guys can avoid that and having to go through that. So, we look at alert flow. Where is all the data coming from? And this is imperative too for you, whether you have an MDR provider or you don't, and you run your own SOC team. It's good to know where your data is coming into, whether it's coming in from your SIM or what data is feeding into your SIM. So just as an example, we'll aggregate all that information. So we have our SIM data sources, information coming from Microsoft Defender or Splunk or, CrowdStrike, Falcon, right? All that data then goes through, and we apply rule sets against that, whether those are vendor-based rules or we have our own critical start rules. We have 70,000 different types of alerts that we can apply to that. So those are custom signatures, IOCs and things that we're looking for. And then that goes through what is called our trusted behavior registry. So this is that TBR. This is where we leverage, like I said, a little bit of artificial intelligence. This is where we leverage our whitelists and our playlists to drop events that aren't really of interest. And anything that falls outside of that, it's either global, that's applied to all of our customers, or local, that's applied to just your environment. It's important to go through that process, right? Regardless of whatever technology or vendor you have, it's important to make sure that you are whitelisting and tuning the events that are coming through, and then applying the playbooks that you need for that investigation, and whether or not those become either true positives or things that are unknown that require additional investigation that need to be escalated. But it's important to get to that state where you understand what your true positives are for your environment. Those are your high fidelity rules, are clearly triggering properly. And then also your false positives. Do you have a massive, number of false positives that you're triaging on a day-to-day basis? Maybe that's, indicative of your alerts needing or requiring further tuning. So your alerts really tell you a story, and it's important to listen to that so that you're not, once again, wasting your time. It's also important to track metrics. I think this is incredibly important. So what you'll see here is a number of events that are coming in, but tracking metrics on what is your mean time to detect? What is your mean time to respond to that? How long does it take you to actually triage a particular alert or event? How much time are you spending on false positives? How many resources are you leveraging? What is your false positive rate? What is your true positive rate? What is your analyst utilization and workload, distribution? How many alerts are being triaged per analyst? If you have a small organization, this is a little bit easier. Maybe you only have 2 SOC analysts, but it's important to understand, once again, what are those limitations, right? For maybe having a smaller team, right? And where your gaps of time where you're going to potentially miss something, if you don't have that 24/7 eyes on glass capability. So measuring those metrics can really help drive potentially additional funding, help drive maybe additional processes or new tooling, or thinking kind of outside the box. How do I work around this if I don't have the resources or the the budgets to do that? I remember when we first started out, back at DuPont, we didn't really have too big of a budget, from a security perspective. I mean, we did have a good sized security budget, but not as big as you'd think initially. And we didn't have funding for being able to collect everything in a centralized SIM, believe it or not. So, I put out a customized Linux box where we ported all of our proxy logs into it, and I was using, Linux grep commands looking for command and control activity. And this was how I got around, not having to spend any money, but really just kind of spin up the resources that I have. So sometimes you have to think outside of that box, right? I know it's difficult sometimes in those situations where you don't have the proper funding, but I never let a good incident go to waste. So as soon as those incidents occurred, I immediately bubbled that up to the CEO and said, okay, I need some more money. We need some best of breed technology so that we avoid this kind of going forward. So what does the alert triage process look like? I meant to put this slide a little bit sooner. Sorry about that, but let's just go through that process. So, let's say an alert triggered. This is your initial notification from your SIM, from one of your endpoint detection technologies. This is when suspicious activity is potentially detected. So that's number one. The question you always have to ask is this an actual attack? Right? This is the step that involves kind of analyzing the alert and determining whether it's a true positive or potentially a false alarm. And this can be difficult sometimes, especially if you're not a seasoned, security analyst and you're just looking at things for the first time, or you're relatively new to the organization and you're just looking at security events. Context is important, and understanding what an attack looks like is also incredibly important. And people who are seasoned in this particular space can look at a single log alert and almost immediately know or feel that something is off. So kind of getting to that state, I think, is important. And then, was the attack successful? Did they get in? Let's say, for example, a phishing email came in, they clicked on a link or an attachment in an attempt to execute some sort of macro code. Doesn't mean that it was necessarily successful, because there could have been a technology that actually prevented that macro code from even executing in the first place. Is it good to know that there wasn't a potential attack that occurred? Absolutely, right? There was an attempt of an attack. Here's the phishing email. Make sure we clean up, all those phishing emails out of the rest of the inboxes that may have been targeted. But understanding whether or not that was successful is also a critical step, because if it was successful, then you got to worry about the blast radius. What other assets were affected? That is referred to, blast radius, understanding what is the scope of the breach, what other devices are involved, what other systems, what other, user accounts might have been, leveraged or dumped, or maybe they have credentials for. So understanding, the level of propagation associated with that particular potential breach is very, very important, especially when it comes to, cleaning up that attack. Because you really, truly need to understand the scope of your breach, before you do a full shutdown and eradication of that particular threat in your environment. And then what other activities occurred? You can't just look at a single alert. Alerts are not single, threaded. You can't just look at it at its surface. You need to understand, context around that event. What other events transpired? What other events occurred? Where did that come from? Did it authenticate from another device, on the network? What is that device? Is that suspect zero? It's always important to trail it back to, the initial device where it came in on. I remember I think it was Christmas morning, 2022. Christmas morning, 2022. My kids are opening their presents. We had an alert in the console. An incident came up, and we saw credential dumping occurring on a domain controller. But this was the first alert that we saw for the environment, and obviously we immediately went into IR mode. We were able to, successfully start resetting, those devices. But the problem is, the usernames. But the problem was we didn't know where suspect zero was. How are they getting in? And as soon as we started doing forensics on the domain controller, we were able to tie it back to an RDP server, a remote desktop, server. So this was an externally facing RDP system, but no multi-factor authentication was applied to this. So no two-factor authentication was applied to this particular device. It allowed the threat actor to brute force their way into the RDP server. None of our security technology was on that. It was actually an IT admin that had spun this up, and didn't, he connected it to the domain, but he didn't follow the appropriate steps of securing that particular, device or system down. But now that we knew what suspect zero was, we were immediately able to respond and isolate that RDP server and cut it off. But this, comes down to, rogue assets, or, following the appropriate protocols and putting those security measures in place to prevent this type of attack. This was unfortunately a silly mistake. This was actually a smaller customer. It wasn't like a dental office. It was maybe like an auto dealership, but they didn't follow the protocol. And unfortunately, when this happens, you have to be able to immediately respond and know, who suspect zero is, so that you can actually eradicate it. Otherwise, it's going to continue to come in. It's kind of like a, continuous backdoor for that environment. And then how do you respond? based on the findings that you have from the security team, what is the appropriate level of response? Do you isolate the device? Do you start blocking malicious IP addresses? Do you apply patches? Do you take the systems down? I'm a huge fan, especially if it's a state-sponsored attack or even a ransomware threat. You're able to actually eradicate before ransomware was deployed. I think it's important to shut down the systems once you understand the true scope of the incident, all at the same time, and then you do a full image, restore. Right, you're restoring so that there is nothing left on that particular device, no implants, no left, nothing left behind by the threat actors, because a lot of times when they get onto a machine, they leave other persistence mechanisms behind that allow them to come back in. So it's important, once again, to identify your scope and then to kick them out, eradicate them, fully, obviously. So what about leveraging AI for triage? It's kind of hard to see that with that particular picture, but, we're in the age of artificial intelligence. Do I think, artificial intelligence is going to replace SOC teams? Absolutely not. I do think, having a human eye and that intuition and everything else is going to play a very important role, because false positives are going to occur too, leveraging AI. But I do think there is going to be that element of faster threat detection. AI can analyze massive amounts, vast amounts, right, of data in real time, whereas a security analyst is not going to be able to keep up with that. I mean, let's be honest. So the ability to identify threats at a much faster pace, over a human analyst, we already see that today. So I do think that there is that element that's important up front for faster threat detection. But I also think that having another secondary set of eyes, actually really going to be the primary set of eyes after AI has gone through it, looking at that as a follow-up. I do think there's going to be some improved accuracy and fewer false positives as we evolve, these LLMs associated with triaging security alert data, these machine learning models, as they learn from past data, they're going to be able to triage out legitimate activity and identify, real threats, identify anomalies and be able to bubble those up. So AI is here to stay, and it's only going to be more pervasive. But I think it's important that we embrace it versus, kind of turning away from it. You have adaptive learning and then also contextual awareness as well. Once AI has the ability to then correlate alerts across your systems and understands user context and, user behavior, network flow, and endpoint data, and it can pull from that information historically over, let's say, the past year, that's going to be an incredibly powerful capability to deliver, right? That's going to be, incredibly important too, right? From an analyst perspective, to then respond to truly items, that require a response mechanism for isolation or, revoking user credentials or, removing, emails out of an inbox that are potentially malicious or, any of those things. So I think it's important to, once again, embrace that and think about, what's the future and understand that AI is here to stay. So will AI replace a SOC? I've already kind of said this, don't rely solely on technology to safeguard your organization. I think instead you must explore how AI can enhance and support your SOC team. This was said by a wise field CISO. That was actually me. But no, it's important to think through that and really understand, what we're getting into when we start to leverage that. I actually bought like 5 AI books. I got them on my desktop here, just to make sure that we are staying ahead and understand how we can leverage this technology kind of going forward. So analyst-led, AI-assisted, even though I created this image using AI, I do think that is the future, and I think it's important. So AI is going to play a huge role, and it's something, once again, that we need to embrace. So how do we avoid alert fatigue? Kind of wrapping this up, I like to have my webinars between 30, 40 minutes. I don't want to talk for an hour. Who wants to hear that? These are the items that I would recommend. Optimizing your security, tech stack. Alert fatigue in cybersecurity, unfortunately, it's a real problem, something that we're going to have to deal with, but it's largely due, once again, to an overly, whelming number of tools that companies use to protect themselves. We're always being told from marketing that we need this, we need that, we need this, but it's important to just, once again, look at your security stack and understand, what do you truly need, and really focus on the vectors of an attack that adversaries take, your identity, your email, your endpoint, your cloud, the primary mechanisms that they infiltrate those particular vectors, focus on security technology that covers those areas, ensure that your tools are integrated properly. Not all tools are maybe necessarily going to talk with one another, but having, direct API, type integrations, having maybe a SOAR type technology or platform that has the ability to respond, based on playbooks, that's going to be important. Right, it's going to be important to reduce alert fatigue and reduce the amount of work that analysts are going to have to do. Right, if you have already predefined playbooks, Reduce your threat surface. That's going to be important. By reducing your threat surface, you're going to actively remove, kind of those attackable points of interest, and you're going to improve your defenses. So when you have fewer attack points, you're also going to have fewer alerts to manage and come through. So reducing your threat surface is going to be important. Tackle quick win security basics. I can't even tell you how many times, I've done an investigation for a client, and it always comes back to something incredibly basic that they didn't have in place, whether that's, two-factor authentication, or even just having a general security awareness program in place where they are testing, end users' ability to identify phishing, campaigns, or, not clicking on links and attachments. It seems like I've been talking about this for, 15, 20 years since I've been in this space. It's still a problem, and it's only going to get worse, especially with obviously AI. These emails now are crafted perfectly, using like a chat GPT, whereas, back in 2011, 2010, it was so bad. It was almost too obvious, and yet they were still clicking on links. So I think, attempting to alter human behavior and at least having individuals identify, what are those points to make sure that I'm not clicking on those, potentially malicious links. That's going to be incredibly important for your organization. Tuning and prioritizing threat alerts. We've talked about that throughout this, whole presentation. That is, hands down going to be one of the most important things to do from, alert fatigue perspective, spending that time up front. And it's a continuous process. It's not something that, necessarily goes away. This is something that will continue throughout the life of your detection technology, deployments, and your SOC team organization. You're always going to be tuning and prioritizing. So, hiring individuals who have a passion for that, who, can look at logs and alerts all day without getting tired. I could look at alerts for 15 hours straight and not get tired. I absolutely love it. There are freaky people like that out there, like myself, that love this space, that can do that. And I think it's important, right, to find individuals that are, happy doing that, because you don't want to end up with that intern that I had that allowed that phishing attack to occur. And then also sleep more soundly with an MDR. If you need a managed detection response, company, organization, or an outsourced, SOC team for monitoring 24/7, look into that. Maybe it's more affordable than hiring, full-time employees internally. Unfortunately, we're in this space where, you have to make those, types of decisions. Obviously, it would be great to build your own SOC team. If I was working on the other side of the fence, not in a vendor, I would love to build a SOC. But if I don't have those resources to do it, it'd be great on day one to have a threat hunter with 20 years of experience, or an incident responder that has 30 years of experience, doing this sort of thing. That's what you get in MDR providers, is you get that real world experience up front on day one. We have around, close to 100 SOC analysts distributed across the, the United States, primarily in 2 locations. But, that SOC team is working 24/7. And that's really important when you're evaluating MDR providers. If you are looking, right, is to make sure that you have that 24/7 and they have the ability to respond, and they're not just providing guided remediation, because if something happens in the middle of the night, you want them to respond. So that's kind of where I would leave it off in terms of avoiding alert fatigue and wrapping it up with the bow. So I do want to just say thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Tim Bandos. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, but I do want to open up to Q&A in a second. Also, feel free to reach out to LinkedIn as well. Be friendly. I'm friendly. Let's engage in a conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Terry now.
Tim, that was great. Really great context and broad perspective on the whole alert process management issue. Really, really well done. I also appreciate you ending on the note around AI and its both its promise and its limitations. Really curious from the tools either that Critical Start may be developing internally, or even tools that you may have seen. What are the early returns or the early results of these AI-based filtration assists, I guess we can call them, that SOC professionals are using? What's your sense there in a broad sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say about maybe even 2 years ago, we started leveraging AI, not for alert triaging or tuning, but kind of alert enrichment and following up with our customers. So making sure that we had a standard response based on, what we were seeing, providing contextual event hints like, hey, look at this and make sure you have this. And so really AI was being used for the investigation process of alerts. It was helping our SOC analysts kind of go through that process. And now we're really at that stage where, it can start triaging those events improvements in alerts automatically where we don't have to spend cycles necessarily, looking at the same thing over and over again and then adding them to playbooks. Now, of course, we always have this integrity system where we're also understanding what is AI doing for us so that we avoid, any sort of mishaps, because, there are real issues too from an AI perspective where false positives could occur. And the worst thing is if a true positive occurs and AI missed it, right? We want to make sure we avoid that. So we still have a heavy set of eyes on what everything is, being done in the background. We at Critical Start, we're more human-led, AI assisted, like we're leveraging AI, but not to the full extent quite yet.
That's great. Thanks for taking a deeper cut at that. Just want to remind our audience, you can participate in the Q&A by typing your question into that Q&A text box located at the bottom of the presentation window. If we can't get to all the submitted questions during our live session today, we'll be sharing them with Tim, who can also reply to you offline. Tim, we have a question from audience member Long. Have you ever missed an important alert because of too many distractions? How did you handle it? Maybe you haven't done this recently, but maybe there's an anecdote you can share with us.
Yeah, Long, it's a great question. There's absolutely no way I've ever missed an important alert that I'm aware of because I am a machine. I'm like the Matrix. All right, Long, like that. I don't know if I could live with myself if I missed a critical alert. But I shared that anecdote, that story, about but he wasn't no longer an intern, but that full-time employee that missed something, and that had implications for our company, believe it or not, because when you miss something, even for a day in a high-risk environment like a DuPont, like an IoT type of environment where you have operational technology and there could be real-world implications for a particular threat making its way into that vector, right, of the segment where they could potentially blow things up. That's important, right? So, we took that as a learning lesson and really kind of put in, standard operating procedures to avoid it going forward, making sure that we, were constantly rotating out individuals, making sure that we had, things in place as a stopgap to avoid those distractions and the alert fatigue. But it's a great question. I would bring it back to the example that I gave, though, during the presentation.
Thanks. Karen from our audience is asking, how do you train the internal team to handle what a SOC does? Is this even possible?
Yeah, so when you say internal team, are you saying, I'm assuming you're not talking about the SOC team, but you're saying like an internal team to the organization, or are you talking about the SOC team? I'm not sure if I'm really interpreting that, but if it's, an internal company, I think it's important to talk about the value that a SOC team brings, right, to the company, to the organization, why it's important, to have a cybersecurity organization in the first place. I think in 2025, that's a no-brainer, right? We want to avoid being a news headline, because of a breach, and we see that day in and day out. As far as a SOC team and having, people hired on, I always think it's critical to hire, that one SOC leader, someone who has had, 15, 20 years of experience, pay that money up front for that person. And even if you only hire one or two people, that's all you almost need a lot of times, depending on the size of your organization, to keep that thing going. Because they'll understand from, a skills perspective who they need to hire, and hire someone who's hands-on, someone who has forensic capabilities, someone who has, the ability to do incident response investigations and understands the critical artifacts that need to be lifted off a device for investigations, who's done threat hunting. There are individuals out there, a lot of people actually in the industry that can do that. So I think having that experience is absolutely critical. And then you can hire on, lower level security analysts that they can then train up. That's where I would start personally.
Thanks, Tim. Take a shot at this question around the specific metrics or KPIs that organizations should use to track and measure and, of course, improve their alert and management effectiveness. What do you suggest to customers there?
Yeah, there's like 5,000 KPIs you can measure in a SOC team. The ones that, we always focus on is, mean time to respond, mean time to detect, what was the time that the alert came in from the time that, allowed individuals to start triaging the event. So we, for example, have a 60-minute SLA. So every single alert, that comes in, whether it's low or critical, it's triaged within under 60 minutes. It doesn't matter the severity. If it's critical, it's within 10 minutes. But I think holding yourself to that standard where you have timelines, that's really important. I think looking at alert volume, what are the metrics of how much data is coming in? What is the alert triage time. Some alerts are going to require more triage time. For example, phishing investigations. If you see an individual clicked on a link, you maybe have to, drop that in a VM to explode it to see where does that particular site go to, in a segmented and safe environment, of course. But understanding the time it takes for your team to do that is going to be important, because that'll tell you how many SOC team members you need to hire, have in place. Looking at false positive rate. That kind of speaks to detection engineering. How much time you need to spend on improving the quality of your detections. True positive rate, same thing. What's your rate detection history? And then also, I talked a little bit about this during the presentation, but your analyst utilization and workload distribution. So how much time, how many alerts are each analyst taking on per day?
Rory from our audience is asking, do you also use LLMs and AI for SOC member or analyst training to prepare for alerts? That is, as a training environment, as in a training environment, or do you use it more as an augmentation in the live environment? What's your sense there, Tim?
Yeah, so we have, at Critical Start, we have full-time employees that their only job is to build educational material, for training our SOC team members. So we actually don't hire experienced analysts. We take them right out of college. So as soon as they graduate with a degree in cybersecurity or whatever it is, we put them through a 300+ hour boot camp training that we continuously develop and put through. And we leverage, AI probably to, constantly enhance the content of that training, but it's all real world scenarios, things that we've seen over the last 15 plus years of delivering MDR services. And we get them to a state where they're not even looking at any alerts within the Critical Start platform until they've gone through that 300+ hours, and then provide 40+ hours a year of training going forward. So I think having a rigorous training platform in place is imperative, right? Making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page and they're all singing the same tune.
Tim, what do you tell smaller security teams that say don't have the resources of a full-blown enterprise SOC with regard to how to triage their alerts? What are some of the best practices you can offer there?
Yeah, so I always focus on visibility first. Understand visibility of your environment. So do you have, what sort of technology do you have deployed? Do you have an EDR solution? Do you not have an EDR solution? Making sure, though, that all of those data sources are coming to a centralized location, even if it's not a SIM, or maybe it's something you built yourself with log elk stack and kind of all those free solutions. I think that's step one, is making sure that you have that appropriate visibility, and then start using risk-based alert prioritization. Really focusing on the alerts for your highest critical assets. Let's say you have, critical assets have intellectual property or trade secrets on them. Any sort of alerts that trigger on those particular devices, elevate that, right, for investigation. I think it's important to leverage threat intelligence. Threat intelligence offers, a great ability to enrich the alerts that are coming in. So if there's threat intelligence associated with a particular ransomware group, maybe an IP range is, attempting to come into your environment associated with a, ransomware group, that helps you once again to focus on those, types of alerts. Maybe there's lightweight SOAR tools that you can use to automate a lot of that. I think it's getting to a state where you're automating, you're leveraging playbooks, you're kind of taking that human element out as much as you can if you don't have enough SOC team members to do it, and as costly as possible. I mean, so if I were to go to an organization with not much to do, that's what I would do, is just try to build it up with the tools that I could, even if they were open source tools.
Thanks, Tim. Close us out with some thoughts on how organizations can effectively prioritize alerts without also missing critical threats.
Yeah, so I talked a little about this. So focusing on those critical assets, your crown jewels, that's identifying your most sensitive data. That's number one. Your high risk systems. Implement that risk-based alerting. Start with the basics. Make sure you're focusing on those top threat vectors like phishing and credential abuse and ransomware. Those are the types of elements that you're going to want to focus on right out the gate. And I think if you do that, you're going to have a more successful program. Even if it's not perfect in the beginning, this is where you have those learnings, and you can further improve and mature it over time. I think that's also important to understand, that you don't need to be enterprise grade or have best of breed security technology in order to be the best at detecting everything across your environment. I think it's having the right processes in place, making sure you have the right people too in place is important as well. And I was talking a little about that, is having someone who that you hire that has that level of experience and can leverage those tools to the fullest capabilities. So that's what I would do. That would be my advice to the group.
Tim, one more question from Lee in our audience. Lee's asking how you keep customer data from being exfiltrated by LLMs, and is there a means of reducing the risk of the LLM from hallucinating alerts or a lack thereof?
Well, so customer data and LLMs, once you have kind of an on-prem LLM, distribution, we're not leveraging like ChatGPT for doing alert triage, right? We're not going out to the internet or sending anything data like DeepSeek, back to China. These are localized LLMs that are learning, and they're heavily protected and safeguarded. And we have SOC 2 Type 2 control, certifications around that to prevent that. I think that just comes down to having all of those controls in place to prevent, obviously, any sort of data exfiltration or breach of information. Because to us, that would be as an MDR provider, that's the most critical thing, is protecting customer data, especially when it's within our platform. So we take that incredibly serious. We actually have a fantastic CISO, George Jones. I'm not the CISO, I'm the field CISO, so I'm more like out and about rubbing elbows, and the executive account sponsor that provides strategic guidance to our CISO customers. But he does a fantastic job of making sure that we're heavily secure in that space.
Well, that is going to bring us to our time. I want to thank our audience members, but I also want to thank Tim Bandos of Critical Start. Tim, we appreciate your time and expertise on being a lot smarter and not drowning in alerts. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you as well to our sponsor, Critical Start, as well as everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Sometime within the next 24 hours, you'll be receiving a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to share this with colleagues and peers who couldn't have been a part of the live presentation. Now for the boilerplate, the webinar is copyright 2025 by Informa TechTarget. Presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Critical Start, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our guests, Critical Start, and the Dark Reading team, I'm Terry Sweeney. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.